favorite memory of George Frederickson occurred at an ASPA conference in the 1990s when he literally put public administration on trial. And I think what he was trying to do was to engage all the practitioners, scholars, and students in the attendance at that conference to think reflectively about what is the value, what is the meaning of public administration. And that will remain my longest standing George Frederickson memory.
For me, I think it's when the Wilder School at VCU, we hosted the Social Equity Conference in 2007. And we were giving out our Social Equity Award, and it was the inaugural award. And we decided to do a lifetime Social Equity Award. And it really made sense to honor two people. One was Phil Rutledge and the other was George Frederickson. Both of them had been very instrumental as fellows of the National Academy for Public Administration in advancing the Academy's work on social equity. Unfortunately, Phil Rutledge died a couple of weeks before our conference, very unexpectedly. And so it turned into partially a memorial service for Phil as well. But we gave out the award, and when we gave out the awards, we decided we were giving out both awards, which we already knew we were giving out both awards. But George did not know that he was the other recipient of the award. And so when we did it at dinner that night and George received that award, he was just so amazed, so floored, so shocked. It was just a very emotional award acceptance. He was crying, we were crying. It was wonderful. And I thought of all the awards and all the accolades that George Frederickson has had over the years, well deserved. The fact that the Social Equity Award that we gave him meant that much to him was really very touching to me. So that's my favorite memory, I think, if I had to limit it to just one.
When I think about that, I go back to 2012 at his Festschrift, that event when a number of scholars came together to, present papers that bore heavily on the work that he had done. And I had a good time being there. And as I presented and everybody else presented, I watched him to see how this played in his head. And he listened attentively. He seemed comfortable. He seemed pleased. And I thought to myself, this must be a good feeling for him to see all of these ideas that have really grown legs. And that was a very positive day. But I'll tell you, the fun part of it was that evening at dinner, my very favorite part. Because at dinner, for every one of the participants, he had supplied a George Frederickson bobblehead. And so it was too bizarre and too funny, and we all had a great laugh at it. And I thought that was fun.
My favorite memory of George is something that actually just happened last October at NASPA. I was having lunch with a colleague, and we were down in LA for NASPA 2019. It was a wonderful conference. And this colleague and I were talking and chatting, and George Frederickson was coming across the street, and my colleague knew him. And so he came over to speak. I met George as an assistant professor probably almost 20 years ago. He, of course, would not have remembered me, but that was okay because he was still very gracious. And when my colleague introduced me to him, the first thing that George said was, "I love your suit." And I was, for me, that was like huge. I mean, the famous Dr. George Frederickson is saying that he likes my suit. And he's just went on about how well it was put together and so forth, and the combination bow tie and so forth, and the man definitely knew style, and so we wound up taking a photo together And I will always cherish that because I had no idea, of course, that would be my last time seeing him. But that is a cherished memory. He was so gracious and just so very kind.
Favorite memory of Dr. Fredrickson was after I had been accepted into the University of Kansas's public administration program, the PhD program. And I took a fly out to Kansas because I wanted to make sure that the school was and the program was the right fit for me. I had been in meetings throughout the entire day. And towards the end of the day, I believe Dr. Fredrickson was my final meeting. And I walked into his office. He told me to put down my Padfolio and we're going to take a walk. So we proceeded to walk around campus, and I was so prepared to have a conversation about social equity and public administration with Dr. Fredrickson, but it really ended up being a conversation about what I wanted to experience as a PhD student in KU's public administration program. And I left feeling that this would not only be a place to become and grow as a scholar, but a place where the faculty, including Dr. Fredrickson, would take great care of me. So I left feeling that Dr. Fredrickson not only cared about me as an incoming PhD student who was going to start later that August, but that he would take care of me as a person. And I was not mistaken. I had a great experience during that visit, and it really was a microcosm of what I would experience over the next 5 years as I pursued my PhD.
My favorite memory of George Fredrickson is when he debated Osborne and Gabler. And so this was in, I believe, 1993 when they came out with the book Reinventing Government. And, they had such popular support for basically running government more like a business. The new public management was booming around the world. Al Gore had championed their book as the core of the National Performance Review. And George traveled around the country and debated them and basically said, these are my words, but the message was it's a phony notion to run government solely like a business. Of course, we want efficient government, but there are social equity considerations. And if we just focus on the business aspects of government, we miss the main reason why we create government entities to serve the public.
Well, I wrote him a letter prior to his Festschrift in 2012, and I sort of reminded him about our first interactions when I was a student, and I was not able to sort of place specifically the dates, but it goes back to 1971. It was I think it was probably my first or one of my first classes at Syracuse. And one of the things we shared was that George was really into Ted Lowy's book On the End of Liberalism. I had taken Lowy's course the year before as I was finishing my degree, undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago. It was the only time in our professional careers when I was his student that he deferred to me. That is, that sort of he accepted what I said and gave me gave me the benefit of the doubt about my claims about the motivation or the logics for some of the arguments in Lowy's book. After that, once I got my PhD and became a faculty member, George was always in the lead. I mean, George was less deferential, partly because George was not without opinion and with a viewpoint. And that's one of the things that made him endearing, I think, is that George didn't sort of beat around the bush and was always sort of clear about his perspective. And you had something sort of to grasp a hold of and sort of have a good debate with him.
I don't think I've even ever shared this with anybody, but I remember I was a newly minted PhD student, I'm sorry, newly minted PhD graduate after I finished my program at the Maxwell School. I was at an APSA meeting, and I was on a panel addressing social equity, and I was going to be presenting some of my research. And so I was standing there, and in walks George Fredrickson, and of course I got very excited because I had not met him before, and you know, he was one of my icons. So I basically walked up to him and introduced myself, and he came to our session, and he participated, and it was a great honor. But it was the first time I actually met him. I just finished the PhD program, and it was August of 1984.
George was president of ASPA when I joined ASPA. So he introduced me to ASPA in a very positive way. And so that's my favorite memory. And I guess, you know, it's kind of the last impression, because even then he was talking about social justice and social equity. So through the years, we've continued to talk. When I became ASPA president, I relied on him. I use his textbook in every one of my basic public administration classes. I still think it's something that we need to use. So the first introduction and the use of his materials, I think, are the things that have had the most impact on me.
I don't really have any close contact with George until I got involved with the National Academy of Public Administration. But when you become a fellow, everyone who gets nominated, might be 100 and some, they all get interviewed by different members of the selection committee. And it just so happened that George was on the selection committee the year that I got nominated and got elected. And George called me. There's some standard questions, includes, you know, what do you know about the Academy and things like that. Well, I had been attending meetings of the Academy, and I, you know, and as Woody Allen says, 95% of success is showing up, and I would show up because of the social equity panel, and I guess I annoyed enough people to get their attention, but not too much that they held it against me. So George, when George was interviewing me over the phone, he says, well, Blue, I'm not going to ask you the normal questions that we would ask a nominee about what do they know about the National Academy of Public Administration. But he says, you know, since you do know something about the Academy, do you think you're deserving to be a fellow, knowing the other fellows? And I quickly thought about the fellows that I had known at that time, and had worked with as an associate member of the Academy. I said, well, certainly not as deserving as some of the people that are fellows, but at least as much as some of the other fellows. And so he apparently liked that answer, and I guess gave a positive recommendation for my candidacy back to the committee, and I got on the ballot and got elected. So that was one of my first personal contacts with George.
Fredrickson, both organizationally and in terms of scholarly work, impacted public administration deeply. From the organization side, he was not only a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, but he was a president of the American Society for Public Administration. And what few people today might recall is back in 1970, he helped usher in democratic processes in ASPA. It used to be that ASPA's leadership was voted upon in a slate, kind of behind the scenes effort, and he led the charge, or helped lead the charge to democratize ASPA. So not only did that usher in the possibility of Fredrickson becoming an ASPA president as a young scholar, but also made possible Phil Rutledge becoming the first African-American to serve as ASPA president. So many people who subsequently served as ASPA leaders owe that opportunity directly to George Fredrickson. From a scholarly perspective, we talk about so many different things. Middlebrook II, what social equity means today and how we might take it for granted had there not been a George Frederickson to lead the way. And so there's generations of scholars and frankly, generations of his alumni who owe their careers to the guidance and the light that he shed.
I've followed most closely his work in terms of social equity, and I think that aligns with the mission of the DSJ section as well. But, you know, that really is just the tip of the iceberg. He's made lots of contributions to local government, to bureaucracy and understanding organizations, to understanding sort of theoretical approaches within the field of public administration. All of that stands out. You know, he was founder of the Journal of Public Affairs Education and JPART, and worked, you know, very, very closely there. And then, you know, Meadowbrook. I mean, George Frederickson and his contributions to Meadowbrook, you know, Meadowbrooks 2 and 3, and being there for those. You know, he, and my understanding was that George Frederickson was at all of the Meadowbrooks except the last one that we had. And we had hoped that he was going to be able to join us there. So, you know, his mark in terms of Meadowbrook was also huge in the field. So, you know, he's a scholars. He's really been engaged in his work and committed to his work throughout his entire career. And he's done so much to advance the field of public administration.
When I think about George Frederickson's impact and his greatest legacy on public administration, I immediately think of social equity. You know, he made it legitimate to write about social equity in mainstream journals. And that is an idea that needed to be brought forward, and he brought it forward. And then throughout his work, he would always return to that. So I hand it to George Frederickson for publishing that piece in part right after Meadowbrook won. And at the time, it was a subject that hadn't been written about that much, or certainly published in the mainstream journals. And it was important to do that. And it really created a foundation for legitimating the topic of social equity.
There's no doubting that George is considered the father of social equity, right? I think most social equity scholars would agree to that. Him and of course Phil Rutledge laid the groundwork for the work that we are doing now. So I always say that without George's contributions, there would be no me. And I say that because in graduate school, when I was at DePaul University in the late 80s, we studied Frederickson. But of course, I was a 22, 23-year-old and really could care less about social equity. I was just taking it as a course. Little did I realize the impact that work would have on me as a professor in the field of public administration and policy. So I thank George for again having the temerity to get this subfield going, this field going again with his, I'm sure, dear friend and colleague, Phil Rutledge, during the late 60s or so. And it's because of them that I have a career, and one that I truly, truly love. So I'm very thankful for their contributions to me as a professional and to our greater field, because we have now quite a growing amount of social equity scholars, and that's quite a legacy. It's quite fabulous.
He pushed the field to answering big questions. One of the things that it's easy to get distracted by as a scholar is how we can achieve things that have small impact, as long as it sometimes adds to our CV. Dr. Frederickson cared little about the length of his CV. His impact was in causing us to and pushing us to answer big questions. And that includes social equity, that also includes governance, that also includes how we think about how universities function and operate outside of public administration space. And he is somebody who wanted us to think big. Dr. Fredrickson was a member of my dissertation committee. And it is so easy to get caught up in very small details tied to one's dissertation committee or tied to one's dissertation. And there is nothing wrong with that. You want to be very specific and precise when you're trying to produce such a product. But Dr. Fredrickson always challenged me to not forget about the big picture. And so here's what he's done for the field. We answer and ask and really think about a host of questions at the core of public administration. And he wanted for us to think about the broader public values that are tied to our research, including social equity. And he really pushed us to think about the so what. Why is our research important? Not simply for scholarship, not simply for scholars, but also for people who may experience public administration.
I think his biggest impact was being one of the founders of the Public Management Research Association, which I encountered when I was an assistant professor at the Maxwell School in the early 1990s. And I remember very well George having conversations with Barry Bozeman, Brent Millward, and others about their disillusionment with the field. So this is George Fredrickson, a former president of ASPA and a firm supporter of ASPA, but saying that Public Administration Review and the ASPA conference basically were not enough. And these guys were looking for avenues in which to publish and present the most rigorous research concerning public administration, with the goal of really ratcheting up the quality. And George championed this. He put together a board when I was an assistant professor. The first round of board members were all men, and it was pointed out that they needed some women. And I was drafted as one of 3 women to be on the board as a pretty new assistant professor. And I remember reading the Articles of Incorporation for the Public Management Research Association and for JPART. And George had hired an attorney in Lawrence, Kansas to create this organization. And if he was hit by a truck at that time, his son, David Fredrickson, who was at that time a PhD student at Indiana, would inherit JPART and would be the head of PMRA. And at the time, as the only lawyer on the board, I was like, this is really strange. We need to fix this in order to make sure that this organization and this journal are here for everyone. And it was fixed, but looking back, it's just really proof that George was the main force bringing people together to form this organization and this journal and to try to improve the quality of work in public administration. So to me, that's among his many, many, many contributions, that's his biggest. Today, we have an endowment of almost $1 million for PMRA and conferences that are held around the world, one of the top journals. And I think it can be traced back to George and his strategic thinking and pulling in the right people at the right time and really thinking boldly and moving forward with his idea.
George, in my more than 40-year relationship with him, was always on the move on something. If it wasn't sort of creating JPART or creating JPay or promoting the idea of international fellows in the National Academy of Public Administration or trying to rescue ASPA, it was something else. But so what I think is memorable about George, and this sort of is from a period of sort of knowing him for a wide expanse of time, is that he always had something going. And it was always about his vision for bettering the field, which I think began with his focus on social equity. in the original Middlebrook Conference in the late 1960s. So, I think what sort of George is best known for is probably his advocacy for social network or for social equity. And I sort of use the term advocacy because I think George had a much larger influence on our normative perspective about public administration and putting social equity at the center of that than he did about sort of the empirical findings from his research or other sort of aggregate accumulation of empirical results from the research and scholarship with which he was involved. So I think in terms of his influence, it was always that he had something going, and it was about his vision for the field. And a lot of that stuff took hold and has had a sort of a lasting influence, whether it's social equity or JPART or JPay or the other policy issues with which he was engaged in terms of sort of reshaping ASPA and NAPA. And and then we have the specifics of social equity. And one of the things I take away from his advocacy of social equity is as I get older and more senior, and also from some of my other personal experiences, is that I think the normative content of our field is underappreciated and probably underplayed, and it's something to which I want to turn some attention in my remaining years, just as George turned his attention early in his career to social equity, to sort of pressing on what is it that's at the core values of public administration, about which George always had sort of, I think, a sort of a lasting understanding and an understanding that was influential permanently within our field.
When we think about new public administration, I think we think about social equity, and it was really George Frederickson that was the motivator here. I think he influenced a lot of people in their careers because social equity was just an important issue for a lot of us. And, defining social equity very broadly, because I even think of, diversity management, representative bureaucracy. These are all fundamental aspects of social equity. And so it gave us a nice broad rubric to study the topics that we were interested in studying public administration. And then you have this very, well-known scholar who is basically saying this is important to the field of public administration. It should be the third pillar of public administration. It should be an important rationale for public administration in terms of practice and theory.
His book that I use is called Public Administration Attitude. He talked about defending public administration, but he also helped define public administration, define as gardening. So he was very early on talking about us needing to make public administration meaningful in the lives of citizens. And I still think that's what we need to do. In my Stone lecture, I talked about that, how we have failed in fully defining public administration and making it relevant to young people. George did that for the generation, my generation, generation following me. It became something very meaningful, something not abstract and theoretical, but something that had an impact on my life on a daily basis. And that's why I think one of the reasons I've stayed in this field is because it does have meaning to the average citizens. We are the ones who implement the social contract. And that's what George was actually making very clear to us, that we have a fiduciary responsibility to the people we serve. I think beyond that, I think he also was a mentor to a lot of people in this field. And so he had an impact that's lasting long beyond just what he wrote, just beyond his speeches. He actually was a mentor to a lot of people in the field of social equity.
I grew up a person of color in segregated Virginia, lived in a little section of my hometown, Lexington, Virginia, called Mudtown. because we didn't have good drainage and we didn't have good any sidewalks. So every time it rained, my neighborhood turned into a sea of mud. So I had experienced inequities, but I had never really addressed it or heard it addressed from an academic or scholarly. And even now, I keep on quoting, and I'm guided by the fact that George said that public administrators have to recognize that public service can either be provided well or provided not so well. And usually how well it is provided depends upon the political and the economic and the social status of the recipient. And he ends up that little article by saying, public administrators need to develop a compensatory social ethic. That whenever we deliver public goods and services that vary from delivering it equally, we should also always do it in a way that compensates for the inherent disadvantage of being poor, or I might say a member of another marginalized population.
What was significant about George Frederickson's whole career is he didn't invest all his time in one area. He got involved in multiple journals, multiple organizations. He was engaging with students, scholars, practitioners alike. And so he saw the audiences as plural. And I think looking forward, in terms of advancing a social equity agenda, it can't just be a conversation among scholars, or it can't just be a conversation in the classroom. It's going to necessitate the entire public administration community first, and then beyond public administration. It's very easy to get in silos, whether it's in our narrow discipline or sub-discipline. But I think what George Frederickson attempted to emulate was that we need to get beyond these barriers, these false barriers that prevent us from talking with others. And that's what it's going to take to affect the social change that he envisioned over his career.
There are several lessons that we can take from George's work. You know, I think George was clearly an academic, but he was able to bridge strong working relationships with practitioners. And here again, I'll reference the work that he did with Phil Rutledge. And they were a wonderful, probably an unlikely pairing, but a wonderful pairing. And I think we were able to, I think George was really able to understand how, in order for us to really move forward in terms of public administration, we have to engage academics and practitioners. And we have to be able to do that at the strongest and highest levels of collaboration. And I think George was very instrumental in understanding that and in working collaboratively toward that. So I think thus, I think on a sort of a macro level, that would be one of the greatest things that I would say. I think also, you know, George was very instrumental in terms of moving forward equity as a pillar in public administration. And, you know, his work and his championing of that at the National Academy also in many ways put equity into the mainstream. And, you know, before that, oftentimes equity work was marginalized within the field. And I think largely through George's work, through the National Academy of Public Administration and the Standing Panel on Social Equity, we were very successful and continue to be successful in having equity be part of, you know, it's another E, it's not a marginalized E. And we have George to largely thank for that.
I think of what it took to write about social equity when he wrote about it. And obviously it was springing forward from the topic of the times in the late 60s, from the Meadowbrook I conference. But what that article did is it challenged the canon. It stretched the canon. It took public administration literature beyond planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. And it nudged it forward, and it nudged the boundaries outward some. And that kind of stretching is something that must be done if we are going to intellectually move the canon and to make it current and to address topics that are difficult but very, very important.
I just think that he was really a very humble individual, one that could have continually stuck out his chest and said, "Look at me, look at me, look at me," and so he exercised how leadership, how servant leadership should go. We are all working on behalf of others, and George did that to a fault, and for that I am grateful because it was a visualization that we could all see, and I, I just am again honored to have known him via his work, and again those two interactions that I've had with him, that it will go down in history for me. And I believe that's the type of he's the type of servant leader. He's the type of professor. He's the type of colleague. He's the type of friend that I am forever striving to be.
The thing that stands out to me, and the way in which Dr. Fredrickson was a good example, is that he not simply studied and advanced social equity, but he lived out social equity when it came to his teaching and his service as well. And so the larger lesson there is, anytime we care about an issue, in this case, social equity, how can we make sure that we're identifying synergies across research, teaching, and service? I think research is something that's noble. I think research is something that is necessary. I think research is something that is essential in order to advance the field. But if we move forward with research without thinking about impacting the field through our teaching and service, then we've not maximized our impact. And so I really think Dr. Fredrickson practiced what he preached. And when you look at his research, when you look at his teaching, when you look at his service, you can see social equity tied throughout all of those categories. And he really demonstrated that being a scholar is really about being a triple threat: research, teaching, and service. They all matter.
You know, I think one of the biggest lessons of George's work is that, yes, of course, we want government that is efficient, but we also want government that serves everyone and serves everyone equally. And if we focus solely on efficiency and err too far on that side of running government like a business, we miss out on the main purpose of government, which is to serve the people, to serve all the people. And in my view, that is the biggest lesson learned of George's legacy that is inspirational for all of those who follow.
Okay, fantastic. So do you have anything else to add when reflecting on George's legacy?
You know, I got to see George on a daily basis at the University of Kansas for 8.5 years. And our offices were right next to each other. He gave up his big office when I took over as Steen professor. And I will say that on a daily basis, I saw him work only with kindness. And to serve his colleagues and his university only with kindness. He was one of the nicest human beings I've ever met, and certainly welcomed me and worked collaboratively with me. And that day-to-day action to me is just as important as the big ideas, the big publications, and the big building of infrastructure in the field that he did. He was a truly, really nice man.
Persistence and sort of the core set of values and beliefs, I think, sort of are important legacies that George gives us that we all ought to embrace, because God knows that those of us who believe in public administration and pursue public administration day in and day out are continuously challenged about our value for our societies. And unless we sort of persist, we will not be able to realize that value not only for us, but for others. And I think that's what George did.
I think we need to get more aggressive with certain issues. For example, police violence against Blacks and brown people in our society. I don't think we as a field approach these issues as aggressively as we should. And I think part of it is that people still get very uncomfortable in the field when we start talking about normative issues, but public administration has a normative basis, and social equity, even as George advanced it, I mean, there's a normative basis to that. The field ought to be concerned with social equity. That is a normative statement. Representative bureaucracy started out as a normative theory. We ought to have people represented in the bureaucracy as they exist in the general population. We can't count on Congress to do this because Congress is not representative of the general population. We rely on the power of the bureaucracies to do this. And so I feel that we should still go back to the normative roots of the new public administration and its social equity. And we should be more aggressive in addressing some of these very important contemporary issues in the field. And one of them is again, police violence against Blacks and Browns in our society. We have not really done that as a field, and that's one area where I think we could advance the work of George Frederickson. I mean, it is absolutely a social equity issue, and the field just needs to be more open and less conservative about how we can impact these issues as a field.
He talked in his book about the 1% controlling 40% of the wealth and the 11% controlling 90% of the wealth. And he saw very clearly that was not sustainable in a democracy, that we had to, in fact, do what we could as public administrators in administrating the social contract or implementing the social contract to make space for everybody to live up to those inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's what George was trying to do. Help us to understand that we are the administrators of the social contract. We have a fiduciary responsibility that to make all the elements of society successful as possible, and to make sure that they at least have an opportunity to achieve their very best. And so George spoke that, he lived that, he wrote about that, and that's, to me, his legacy.
In policy analysis, we always are looking for the most effective alternative to reach the objective. And so that's the first question in policy analysis. What is the most effective alternative? But George points out that the second important question in policy analysis is effective for whom? Because we know that there are lots of programs that are effective for maybe the 1% or the 5% or the more privileged members of our society that aren't effective for the other 95% or at least 50% unprivileged viewed in terms of society. And so, in a sense, equity was not only a pillar by itself, but it's also a dimension of effectiveness. We always got to ask the question, effective for whom?
Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your guidance. And on behalf of the other ASPA past presidents, we stand united to carry forward your legacy.
Thank you, George. You've been a real pioneer in advancing social equity in the field of public administration. We have much work left to do, but thank you so much for showing us and paving the way.
Thank you, George, because your work made a difference.
Your legacy continues, and I am grateful and humbled and honored to be a part of your legacy as we continue to do the work that you started during the 1960s. Thank you, George.
Thank you for being a supporter of mine, a great mentor, and somebody over the years who I considered a friend. And thank you for not simply viewing me as a scholar, but as a person. Thank you for leaving me as a person better off than when we first met. And because of you, I believe that I am a better researcher, a better teacher, and someone who has served the discipline with a great degree of enthusiasm. And I know I can do so much more. And I'm grateful that I have you as the perfect example to emulate. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for urging us to think big, to ask big questions in our research, to think strategically in building the field, and to think big in terms of how we can serve all of the public as public servants and as researchers and scholars of public administration.
Thanks for the memories. I will miss you, but it'll be hard. It's impossible to erase the many good times and many things we did together. And I appreciate your being with me for almost the last 50 years. Thanks.
Thank you, George, for not only your work, but for your presence in the field, your magnificent presence in the field. I will miss you dearly. I'm throwing a virtual kiss and a virtual hug, and you will be remembered forever in the field. The legacy of public administration hinges on you and your work. Thank you, George.
I hope that you always know, but I want you to know how much you have meant to me and my growth as a public administrator and as an advocate of social equity. You got me started in this field with your early writings. You have been a constant presence in my professional life. I've enjoyed you as a friend. I've admired you greatly. And all I can say is thank you, George, for all that you've done.
Thank you, George, for your passion, for your contribution. And particularly, George, thank you for realizing 30 years ago, at this point in time when we're talking about issues of social justice, that you fought to make social equity a component of public administration, one of the pillars of public administration, speaks well not only to your foresight, but the foundation and legacy that you've left for us. And all I can say, George, is thank you, rest in peace, and we're gonna build on the legacy that you've laid for public administration to in fact make not only just a pillar in theory, but a pillar in reality. Rest in peace.